You said yes again today, not because you wanted to, not because the request was reasonable, or the timing was right, or you had the capacity to follow through without it costing you something real. You said yes, because the alternative, the small, clean, entirely justified no, produced a feeling in your body that you have learned, over years of practice, to treat as an emergency. A tightening, a flicker of something that is not quite dread, but lives in the same neighborhood. And then, before you had fully registered what was happening, the mouth produced the sentence the body never authorized, and you called it your nature. This is the misunderstanding that has organized a significant portion of your life. The belief that what looks like gentleness is what it appears to be, that the person who never causes conflict, whose name does not come up in arguments, who has been described by nearly everyone who knows them with the same small word, nice, is soft by nature, that kindness is simply what comes out of them. The way water comes out of a spring, unforced and inexhaustible. It is a flattering explanation. It is also, in most cases, false. What looks like gentleness is very often precision. The chronically nice person is not soft. They are calculating constantly at a speed that has become invisible even to themselves. They scan a room and calculate what it will cost to disagree. They read a face and calculate whether the truth is affordable right now. They hear a request they have no capacity to fulfill and calculate in less than a second that the discomfort of saying no will outweigh the exhaustion of saying yes. And then they say yes and call it their nature. That is not kindness. That is a risk assessment that has been running so long it stopped announcing itself. Carl Jung had a specific understanding of this mechanism, and what he identified in people who had been running it for years was not admirable. He did not describe them as generous or evolved. He described them as hollow, competent, admired, agreeable, and hollow. Jung borrowed a word from ancient theater to describe the face we build to move safely through the world. He called it the persona, the mask worn by actors to indicate which character they were playing. He chose this word deliberately because he wanted to preserve the theatrical quality in the concept. The persona is not a lie. That is the part people consistently get wrong. It is a functional necessity, a working surface between the private self and the social world. Everyone has one. There is nothing pathological about being pleasant at work or adjusting your tone to the room. The danger Jung identified was something else entirely. The danger arrives when the mask stops being something you wear and becomes something you are. When the persona and the self fuse so completely that removing one would feel like removing the other. When you can no longer find, underneath the performance of agreeableness, the original feeling that may or may not have been there when the performance began. Jung wrote about people who had identified so totally with their social face that they had no interior life left that was genuinely their own. And he did not describe this as successful adaptation. He described it as a specific kind of loss, the loss of access to yourself, not through any dramatic event, through the slow, nearly invisible accumulation of 1,000 small suppressions, each one too minor to justify examining, each one reinforced by the warmth it produced, each one making the next one slightly more automatic, until the whole system runs below the level of conscious choice and stops announcing itself as a system at all. Consider what it actually requires to be universally liked. It requires that no one ever encountered the parts of you they would dislike, which means those parts must be identified early, monitored constantly, kept out of view, which means a significant portion of your psychic energy is spent, not on living, but on surveillance, watching your own interior for anything that might surface and cause a problem. You have been your own security guard for most of your life. And the thing about a guard is that he does not distinguish between a thief and a guest. He stops everything at the door. So the anger got stopped, but so did the ambition. So did the preference, the appetite, the strange original opinion, the desire that had no socially acceptable shape. All of it turned away at the same checkpoint, by the same reflex, for the same reason. Something was being protected. It just was not you. What was being protected was the relationship. Always the relationship, not the specific one in front of you in any given moment, but the general condition of being in relationships at all, the guarantee that people would remain available, that no one would withdraw, that the room would stay warm, And that guarantee was purchased. You simply never saw the invoice. Because you paid it in currency no one else could see. There are specific behaviors that give this pattern away once you know to look for them. And once you see them in yourself, you will see them everywhere. The apology that precedes a normal request. Sorry, could I just... Sorry to bother you. Sorry, is this a bad time? You are apologizing for the act of existing in someone's field of attention, which means that somewhere, at some point, you learned that occupying attention required a fee. Then there is the speed of your agreement. Not the agreement itself, the speed. Genuine consent has a small pause in it. The fractional delay of a person actually consulting themselves. Compliance has no pause. It arrives instantly, because nothing was consulted. You have been fluent in a language you never chose to learn. The over-explanation, where a simple refusal gets buried under paragraphs of justification, as though a no needs a legal defense before it can stand. The preemptive softening, the insertion of just and maybe and I could be wrong into sentences you are entirely certain about, filing down the edges of your own perception before anyone can cut themselves on it. The humor deployed as a pressure valve, so that anything true can be said and immediately made retractable. The habit of asking a question when what you have is a statement. Each of these seems trivial in isolation. That is precisely why they survive. No single instance of self-erasure is large enough to justify examining, and so the examination never happens, and the pattern accumulates for decades in increments too small to notice. The way sediment builds a delta. What you are looking at, when you finally look, is not a personality. It is a defense system that outlived the threat it was built for. Because here is the part that takes the longest to accept. This system was intelligent. It was not weakness. It was not cowardice. Somewhere in your early environment, there was a real cost to being fully yourself, and a child who has no power and no exit does the only thing available. It adapts. It studies the emotional weather of the adults it depends on, and it learns to become something that does not generate storms. That is not a failure of character. That is a small person solving an unsolvable problem with the only tool they have, which is themselves. The adaptation worked. That is why it never got revised. The problem with strategies that work is that they never come up for review. A strategy that failed would have been abandoned in adolescence. Yours succeeded. It kept the peace. It earned affection. It made you the reliable one, the easy one, the one who never caused trouble. And so it was reinforced every year by evidence, and it hardened, and eventually it stopped being something you did and became something you were. You were rewarded into this shape. Nobody forced you. That would have been easier to see and easier to resent. What happened instead is that every act of self-suppression was met with warmth, and every act of self-assertion was met with a fractional cooling. And over 10,000 small repetitions, the shape was set. Then one day you noticed you were tired in a way that sleeping did not fix. That tiredness is not depletion. It is the cost of the maintenance. Now widen the lens, because the pattern you are looking at has never lived inside one person. It lives in the space between people, and it requires a partner. Every relationship you are in has a set of terms. Almost none of those terms were negotiated out loud. They were established early, usually in the first few weeks, through a series of small exchanges that nobody registered as significant, and then they hardened into something with the force of law. Who calls first? Whose schedule bends? Whose bad mood gets accommodated? Whose gets managed privately so it does not inconvenience anyone? These agreements are invisible precisely because they were never spoken. And things that are never spoken are very difficult to revise. You did not sign a contract. You just kept behaving in a way that made one unnecessary. Consider what your niceness has actually taught the people around you, not what you intended to teach them. What they have empirically learned from years of consistent data about how you respond to pressure. They have learned that your refusal is soft and can be pushed. They have learned that your discomfort will not be expressed, which means it does not have to be considered. They have learned that if they wait long enough in silence, you will be the one who fills it, apologizes for it, resolves it. They are not villains for learning this. They are pattern recognition machines like everyone else, and you gave them a very clean pattern. People do not treat you the way they do because they misread you. They treat you exactly as you have trained them to. There is a particular role that gets assigned to the accommodating person in any group, and it is worth naming precisely, because it looks like a compliment from the outside. You become the stable element, the one who is fine, the one whose state does not need checking, because it never varies. And because your state never varies, it eventually stops being noticed at all, which is a strange kind of disappearance. You are present in every gathering, and absent from everyone's model of what is happening in the room. They are not ignoring you. They have simply concluded from your evidence that you require nothing. Jung observed something about groups that most social psychology only reached decades later. He noted that a group has its own psychic economy, and that unwanted material does not vanish inside a system. It gets distributed. Someone in every family carries the anger nobody will claim. Someone carries the failure. Someone carries the ease. These are not chosen roles. They are assigned silently by a collective that needs its uncomfortable contents housed somewhere. And the most agreeable member is the most available container. You have been storing other people's discomfort for years and calling it maturity. Watch what happens in a room when tension rises. There is a half second where everyone's nervous system runs the same calculation, and then you speak. A joke, a redirection, a small concession that dissolves the pressure. You have done this so many times that it feels like temperament. It is not temperament. It is a job, unpaid and unacknowledged, that you took on before you were old enough to refuse it, and the people you did it for have no idea it was work. That is the specific loneliness of the accommodating person, and it has almost nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who like you enormously and know almost nothing about you. They are not being negligent. They are responding accurately to what you presented. You built a version of yourself that generated no questions, and then spent years quietly hurt that nobody asked any. You wanted to be known by people you never let close enough to know you. There is a resentment that grows in this soil, and it is a very particular strain. It is not hot. It never becomes an argument. It appears instead as a quiet internal ledger that you consult in private, an accounting of everything you have given that was never returned. Everything you noticed that nobody noticed about you. You have been sending invoices to people who never saw them arrive. And you have never once considered the possibility that they were never sent, because you did not want to be asked. Read that slowly. You did not want to be asked. You wanted to be discovered without ever having to risk the request. There is a difference between the two. And the difference is where a significant portion of your suffering has been manufactured. Asking is exposure. Asking creates the possibility of refusal. And refusal would confirm the oldest belief you carry about yourself, that your needs are excessive, that people would rather you did not have them. So you built a system in which you would be given things without ever having to ask. And when the system failed, as it always failed, you experienced it as evidence, rather than as design. This is the first uncomfortable recognition. Your niceness has been doing something for you, not only costing you. Doing something for you. It has been buying insurance. And insurance is never free. You get moral position. The person who never causes conflict is always the person who was wronged. Structurally, in every dispute they are ever involved in, you never have to examine your own contribution to a broken relationship, because you never contributed anything visible. Your hands stay clean, and clean hands are worth a great deal to someone who is terrified of being at fault. Most valuably, you get the avoidance of a specific piece of information. If you never assert a real preference, no one can reject it. If you never let anyone see what you actually want, no one can decline to give it to you. The accommodating person is not just protecting others from their edges, they are protecting themselves from ever finding out what they are worth to people who know what they are. Being liked for a mask is safe, because if the affection fails, it was never yours to lose. There is something worth noticing about the anger, because the anger is there. It has always been there. You simply routed it somewhere it would not cause problems. Jung was specific about this. What is not made conscious does not stay put. It operates from underneath, and it uses whatever channel is available. And in a person committed to being good, committed to the performance of goodness as the primary organizing principle of their social existence, the available channels are all indirect. Your anger did not disappear when you refused to feel it. It simply lost its address and started arriving anonymously. You know these forms, everyone does. The help offered slightly too visibly. The favor that gets mentioned once, casually, months later. The withdrawal that is never announced so it cannot be discussed. The silence held just long enough to be felt, but not long enough to be named. The advice given in a tone that carries a small blade inside it. The forgiveness extended so generously that it functions as an accusation. The nicest people you know have hurt you in ways you could never point to. And you have done the same. And neither party could ever prove it. This is the shadow, doing what the shadow does when it has no legitimate outlet. A person committed to being good has very few legitimate outlets, so the material finds illegitimate ones. And the illegitimate ones are worse. Not worse in any dramatic sense, worse in the specific sense of being deniable. Because deniable harm is harm you cannot examine, cannot take responsibility for, cannot change. An anger you will not acknowledge is an anger you cannot aim, which means it goes where anger goes when it has no external target, inward. The critical voice that runs commentary on everything you do, the one you experience as honest self-assessment, is not honesty. It is your aggression turned around, given the only target that never generates conflict, working with all the precision it was never allowed to use on the people who earned it. You have been the safest place to put it. That is the arrangement. You keep the peace outside by holding the war inside, and you have called this being a good person for so long that the word good has become almost unusable. Now go further down, because the ledger and the sideways anger are not the bottom. They are the visible layer. Underneath is a question most people manage to avoid for an entire lifetime, and it is not a question about behavior at all. It is a question about what you have been storing. Somewhere in you there is a container, holding everything that was refused at the door. And you have assumed for years that opening it would release something monstrous. That is why you never open it. You believe that if you stopped being nice, what would come out is cruelty. Because you have privately suspected since childhood that cruelty is what you actually are, and niceness is the lid you keep on it. That belief is nearly universal among chronically agreeable people. It is also in nearly every case wrong. Open it, and you do not find a monster. You find a person with preferences. This is the discovery that disorients people who do this work, because they prepared for the wrong thing. They braced for rage and found appetite. They braced for selfishness and found taste, opinion, direction, the ordinary equipment of a self that knows what it likes. What was buried was not your capacity for harm. What was buried was your capacity to want things in your own name, and not apologize for the wanting. Jung said the shadow contains 90% pure gold, and he was not being poetic. He was reporting a clinical observation. For the person conditioned into agreeableness, the exiled material is the good material, the refusal that would have saved you years. The ambition you called arrogance in yourself and then quietly punished. The certainty you softened into a question mark before anyone else could challenge it. The preference for one person over another, which you buried because favoring anyone felt like an act of violence against everyone else. The desire that had no acceptable shape and so was never given one. You are not protecting the world from your darkness. You are protecting yourself from your definition, because that is what a preference is. Every genuine want is an act of self-definition, a declaration that you are this and not that. And a person who is this and not that can be disliked for specific reasons, rather than liked for general ones. Vagueness is universally acceptable. That is its entire function. You made yourself vague so that no one could locate you well enough to reject you, and it worked. And the cost is that you cannot locate yourself either. Everything you have called kindness needs re-examination under different light, and some of it will survive that examination, and some will not. The generosity that left you depleted was not generosity. Generosity has a source that remains intact after the giving. What you were doing was closer to payment, the settlement of a debt you never agreed to carry but never questioned. The patience you extended to people who repeatedly cost you was not patience. Patience is a choice made from a position of options. What you had was the absence of a refusal mechanism, which is not virtue. It is a missing part. The peace you kept in rooms full of dysfunction was not peacemaking. It was the maintenance of a system that required someone to absorb its contradictions. and you volunteered, and the system's survival was purchased with your interior, and the hardest one. The people you protected from your honesty were not being spared. They were being underestimated. Every time you decided someone could not handle the truth from you, you made a private judgment about their strength, and never told them you had made it. You have been managing adults like weather. That is not respect. It is the opposite of respect wearing respect's clothing. None of this makes you a fraud. It makes you someone who has been running an old solution long after the problem changed, which is the most ordinary human condition there is. The day you stop being nice is not a day. Anyone who describes it that way has not been through it. It is not a decision you make once, not a threshold you cross with your jaw set, not a morning where you wake up and finally speak your full truth and everything reorganizes itself into clarity and freedom. What actually happens is slower and considerably less dignified. You say one true thing in a room that expected the usual thing, and the temperature drops half a degree, and you spend the next 4 days composing an apology you will eventually not send. The old system does not resign. It defends itself. It will use your best qualities against you. And it will be persuasive, because it is you. It will call your honesty cruelty. It will point at the person's face and tell you, look what you did. It will produce a wave of guilt, so precise and so immediate that you will mistake it for conscience. That guilt is not a moral signal. It is an alarm installed by a system that is losing its function, and it does not distinguish between harming someone and disappointing them. You will feel like a bad person exactly at the moment you stop being a useful one, and people will confirm it. That is the part you should prepare for, because it will arrive dressed as feedback. You have changed. You used to be so easy to talk to. You have become different, harder to reach. Some of them will mean it kindly. They will be reporting an accurate observation, which is that the arrangement they had with you has stopped functioning. And they will attribute the failure to your character, because the alternative is examining the arrangement. Very few of them will say what is actually true, which is that you used to be less expensive. The relationships that end here rarely end dramatically. They thin. The invitations reduce by one, and then another. The warmth cools by degrees small enough that you can talk yourself out of noticing for months, and then you look up and there is distance, and you will search backward through your behavior for the moment you did something wrong, and you will not find it, because there is nothing there. You did not lose them by becoming worse. You lost them by becoming legible, and legibility is what the arrangement was designed to prevent. The mask was functional precisely because it was unreadable. It produced a version of you that could be related to without ever being known, and some people need that from you. Not out of malice, because genuine encounter, the kind that requires two actual people rather than one person and one performance, is demanding, and the performance was so practiced and so consistent that it never asked anything of them. When it stopped, something was required, and some people discovered they were not prepared to provide it. That is not a verdict on your worth. It is information about what the relationship was built on, and information, however uncomfortable, is always preferable to the continued construction of something on a foundation that was never solid. What replaces the old arrangement is not confidence. That word belongs to a different genre. What replaces it is something quieter, and considerably less satisfying in the short term. A small delay before you answer. A half second where a question actually reaches you before your mouth produces the reflex. That pause is the entire achievement. Everything else follows from it. And it is so unremarkable from the outside that no one will ever notice it happened. Inside, it is the difference between a life and a performance of one. The pause is where the self lives, in the fractional space between the stimulus and the response. In the moment where something is actually being consulted rather than bypassed. In the tiny interruption of a pattern that has been running automatically for so long that it stopped feeling like a pattern, felt like personality, felt like simply what you do. The pause is where you find out that there is a you to consult. That underneath the performance, beneath the accumulated reflexes and the hardened accommodations and the lifetime of small suppressions, something is actually there, with its own assessments, its own sense of what is true, its own preferences, which are not monstrous and not selfish, which are simply specific, which make you, in the most fundamental sense, someone rather than anyone. There is a version of this transformation that fails, and it fails in a predictable direction. The person who has been agreeable for years finds the buried material, and the material is significant. And they mistake its size for its authority. They become sharp with everyone permanently. And they call it finally being honest. They are not free. They have simply moved into the opposite room of the same house, still organizing their entire personality around what other people might do to them. Still reactive, still defined entirely by the social field, just in a different direction. The opposite of a mask is not another mask. It is a face, which is harder, because a face can be seen. Jung's word for the actual work was individuation, and he was careful to say that it never completes. It is not becoming your true self as though there were a finished object waiting under the layers. It is the ongoing, unglamorous labor of noticing which of your reflexes are genuinely yours and which were handed to you by people who needed you to be a certain shape. Most of what you call your personality was installed by people who are no longer in the room, and you will spend the rest of your life quietly separating the two, and you will never finish, and you will get it wrong regularly. Some days the old reflex will win. You will hear yourself agreeing before you have consulted anything. The difference is not that this stops. The difference is that there is now a witness, and a reflex that is observed can no longer pass itself off as your nature, which leaves it as what it actually is, a habit, subject to revision. Everyone who has ever loved you has loved the arrangement to some degree. Not because they were using you, because you offered it consistently for years, and people accept what is offered. So when you stop, you will find out which affections were attached to the arrangement, and which were attached to you. There is no way to find this out safely. There is no way to find this out in advance. Most people never take the test. They keep the coat and stay warm, and are never quite known. You cannot do that anymore, not because you have made a heroic decision, but because you have seen something you cannot unsee. You cannot go back to being unaware that you are performing. You can still perform. You will, often. But the performance will no longer feel like a personality, and the approval that arrives in response to it will no longer reach you the same way. And there is a specific loneliness in receiving affection you can no longer fully accept. Because you know, in a way you could not have known before, that it is the persona being affirmed, not you. This is the actual cost of seeing clearly, not the dramatic cost the fear imagined, not the loss of all relationships. The subtler cost of no longer being able to fully inhabit the warmth of a room that is warming the mask. Jung believed this cost was worth it, not because he was optimistic about human nature, but because he had watched closely enough to know what the alternative produced. A life you can describe accurately, and cannot quite feel. A life in which you are present everywhere, and known nowhere. A life that ends with the strange and permanent regret of someone who was always so careful with themselves that they never actually spent themselves on anything. The real life, the one that is actually yours rather than performed for an audience that never quite saw you, begins at the pause. At the half-second of genuine consultation. At the first refusal that cost something real. At the first honest sentence in a room that expected the usual. Not because honesty is comfortable, but because the alternative has a price you have already been paying for years. And it is time to find out what you have been buying. If something in this landed in a specific place, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been swallowing for the longest time. Because naming it out loud, even once, is the beginning of no longer being required to.